generally you just get stuck and stuck and stuck, and you kind of get blinded because you're put in this almost this this fight or flight state, right? You're just trying to survive to the next day, and we've seen that a lot of our survivors. And unfortunately, there's these abusers use so much power and control. They make these survivors dependent on everything. So where they may have the opportunity to leave, they go back because they have unfortunately no self-value, no self-worth, no empowerment, and no truly belief in their self, which is really, really hard to see, especially when you work with survivors and you try your best to, empower them, but they just can't move on to that next level to get over it.
And I know, clinically speaking, from the experience I've had, people who find themselves in that situation typically never had any self-efficacy built into them over time from parents, and so they just go into one relationship after another that replicates that thumb down on the top of the head kind of power differential. Tell me about some of the reasons, you can't see the air quotes, but the reasons that people give that really to our ears sound like excuses, but they're legitimate reasons in the mind of the person giving them for going back or for staying. And they say, I'm just going to stop there. Give me some of those reasons that you hear about why people return.
Right. A lot of it, and I know you can add on to it because you've talked about it before, it's just the basic needs, whether it's financially, whether it's a roof over your head, whether it's providing food, whether it's providing unfortunately they see it as some form of stability, right? Without them in their lives, they did say, hey, if I have to take this abuse from this person in order to keep a roof over my head, keep my kids closed, keep them fed, and have money to, survive, then that's what I'm going to do. So that's where we see a lot of it, is that financial abuse and those basic needs.
And kids and pets are a huge leverage tool also.
Oh, absolutely. And especially we've seen a lot is stepchildren, right? A lot of abusers use stepchildren as leverage. And that's one question that we ask when we do our danger assessment is, do you have children that aren't the abusers? Because abusers are more likely to abuse their stepchildren than their biological children.
So the idea then is that I need to stick around to protect my children.
Absolutely.
Or I need to stick around to protect my pet.
Absolutely.
And I can't possibly leave because if I do, then he's going to kill the dog. And I say he because I'm gender biased here because the statistics skew that way. But it's a woman trying to leave a relationship. He's going to kill the dog. He's going to beat my kids. He's going to come after me. And then the financial stuff is that a lot of times these victims, until they become survivors, they get out and they survive and they can look back. They will have a narrative that says that they're not capable of finding work, or they don't know how to live on their own, or they don't believe that there's a roof available for them, or maybe they don't believe that they're worthy. Right? How much of that do you hear and see?
I would have to say I would see it, especially in our support groups. When I come in and I help cover our support groups, I see them all the time. They go back to their abusers majority of the time just because they have that. It's just that empowerment's just not there. That sense of belief that they can live a better life without that abuser. It's just not there in their mindset, and it's really heartbreaking to see. Especially when you try your best to talk and just lay out the options for them, and obviously at the end of the day, it's their decision. You can't lead a horse to water and make them drink it. Well, what we've been seeing is that it's really difficult to kind of get these survivors out of these relationships.
And if there's a wistfulness or a sadness that the listening audience is detecting in our vocal tone, it's because it is sad. It's frustrating. But one thing that we're not doing is we're not judging the people. There's absolutely legitimate, long-standing history that backfills these stories that says we totally get why you would go back. From that perspective, it makes sense that you would return over and over until you get some different perspective. And I think that's what a service agency like yours does, like Safe Embrace, is that it provides perspective, because a lot of times isolation is the tool that's used to keep victims in the cycle until they can get out and survive away from it, right? So how does isolation come about, and what are some of the tools? Because we want to talk about red flags here in a second.
Right.
What do you look for?
So when it comes to the isolation, one thing that we see a lot with our survivors when they call, we try to find shelter. Do you have anyone you can stay with in town? Do you have friends? Do you have family? And they're like, I got nobody. Everybody, I've left all my friends, I've left all my family for this person, right? So when it comes to isolation, even if it comes from moving to a different town, from like a geographical standpoint, these survivors get isolated from everything. They're put on their own island with their abuser.
We're talking about power and control as the mechanism, that the tool, the need that gets fulfilled by the abuser upon the abused. So a big part of power and control is telling people who they can and cannot associate with, controlling finances, right down to you may or may not eat the food out of the fridge, right? So, there's some very insidious ways of manipulating people's behaviors based on threat of removal of the financial support, or a psychological manipulation, like nobody will ever love you again. I'm the only one in your life who will ever love you. Look how disgusting you are. You're not worthy. Up to physical abuse of like, don't disobey me or you're going to get a beating again, or I'll destroy your stuff, or threaten loved ones, that kind of thing. So all this works toward isolation. So if you're in the listening audience and you're going, well, how I can't ever put myself in a position where my significant other would isolate me from my friends and family. That's how it starts. It starts little. It doesn't start big. And again, think about if you're raised in an environment where you never were given healthy support and love and affection and taught those things, then that's all you know, and it becomes I don't know if people are familiar with the frog in the pot analogy, but if you stick a frog in some water and put it on the stove and slowly turn up the heat, eventually the frog dies because it doesn't know any better. It just starts to adapt to its environment until it just becomes unsustainable. But if you take a frog and you stick it in some hot water, the frog's going to jump out because it knows that it's such a stark difference from what it is supposed to be living in. So for those of us who are living in a fairly healthy, stable environment, and somebody came to us and was like, hey, you're not allowed to hang out with your best friend anymore, we'd be like, what? No, I'm choosing them over you. But for people who have never known any different, the environment just starts to warm, so to speak, to the point that they just, die from the inside out. Talk about some of the red flags, though. So maybe some people are listening to this and they're like, wow, I think that might be me, but I'm not really sure. What are some identifiers? I mean, you call them red flags. What are some things to look for in one's own personal life?
Yeah, so what we've seen, we have a danger assessment that we ask our survivors when they call in on our crisis line, and we have certain questions, and it kind of gives us a mathematical formula of how severe you are, and it kind of gives us a ranking scale. So the questions that we ask is, if there's a gun present in the home. Now I understand we're in the United States and Second Amendment and all that, but when a gun's present in the home, your chances of getting murdered go up by 300%. Has the abuser ever threatened you with a lethal weapon? Is he constantly or violently jealous? Murder-suicide's a big one. Have you ever thought of suicide? Have the abuser ever thought of suicide? Does the abuser ever try to strangle you? Has the abuser ever tried to beat you while you were pregnant? Has the abuser ever threatened the kids? Has the abuser had any interactions with law enforcement in the past 6 months? Have you tried to leave in the past 6 months? So those questions kind of give us a better idea of what's going on from an advocate standpoint. But if you're asking yes to a lot of these questions, especially if you're listening right now, those are red flags that you should be trying to find an alternative to that relationship.
And those sound really heavy. What are some lower level ones that we may not notice? Stuff like not gaining access to the debit card and that kind of thing, or taking the keys to the car.
So the ones that we've seen, for example, can be financial abuse. Is why don't I have access to your bank account? Even just phone use. Who are you on the phone with? Who are you texting? Right? Who are you calling? Right? Things like that. For example, clothes. For example, I've seen relationships where someone, they didn't like their shades, their sunglasses, and like, I don't like those, we're throwing them away. And then you have to go buy your own sunglasses, right?
Wow.
What else? There are tons of examples I can get. The ones that are just like, what? Why is this such a big deal? Or, the biggest one that we've seen a lot is employment, right? Where, for example, in my previous position doing behavioral health, the wife went and got the husband fired from his job so he can be home more with the kids. But then how do you provide food when you're not working either.
What do you mean got him fired? How's that work?
So she went to the work and was like, hey, you should drug test this guy. Yeah.
You couldn't see that, but my eyebrows went up. So presuming that she knows that he does drugs or whatever, she went to the boss and asked them to drug test her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the manipulation there? She wants him home more with the kids just because?
That and more just power control. Like, I control everything you do. You know, if you ask to jump, you ask how high, kind of thing, right? Where we see that power and control with our survivors.
Where do people get the need for power and control, other than we'll just say that they're mean people and they're hollow on the inside and they're just insecure? Are you seeing things like dependency, enmeshment? You know, like I saved you from your drinking, and you'd never be the same without me, so therefore you must do all that I obey. I mean, like, how much of that versus just straight up being mean?
Mm-hmm. From what I've seen, it's a learned behavior that's become a generational cycle, right? Majority of our survivors, when we talk about this, they learn it from their parents growing up. Our survivors, talk about being molested when they were children. My abuser was also abused as a child and had a horrible environment to grow up in, right? So I think it's a learned behavior, right? And that's where I come in from outreach and prevention education, trying to prevent that next generation from coming up, from being either a victim or an abuser. But what I've been seeing in our line of work is seeing that it's a lot of it's just a generational cycle, and it's just been really bad parenting.
So if we shift gears a little bit, you do outreach, prevention, education. We'll talk a little bit about the job that you're doing now, but in the past job, your job was to go and teach adolescents and youth what healthy relationships look like. And if the listening audience is interested in helping out in this cause, and maybe you don't want to dig into your wallet and just write a check, there's a way to volunteer, and it's to do what you did, right? Which is to be a healthy presence in people's lives. You don't have to have any special magical tools. I mean, it certainly helps to have some training. But talk a little bit about these conversations that you had with the kids on the sports teams, and how that maybe awakened some people and opened some eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. So my original position, like we talked about earlier, was coaching boys and men, which was working and training coaches to talk about their players about domestic violence, because coaches have a powerful role, right? That rapport, that mentorship, that leadership kind of thing. When we've been able to train to tailor it as well, where I've been going in and doing kind of empowering presentations and group trainings on domestic violence and sexual assault and bystander intervention and all that stuff. And the one saying that I always kind of really there's two that I kind of live off of when it comes to my trainings is I've kind of tailored the one where I use a lot for my student athletes is it takes no talent to hustle, and it takes no talent to be a good person. You don't have to be the best looking guy, the smartest or whatever. It doesn't take no talent to have a good heart. And another one is a really good quote from a good U.S. Navy SEAL book. It's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. Right. So when it comes to our presentations, I can talk myself to blue to death about how we can, stop this and all that. But how do we tolerate it? How do we not tolerate this as a community? Right. Giving our youth the tools to not tolerate this kind of behavior.
That's really important, I think, as it plays into bystander intervention, because people who don't understand that concept, basically, if you're watching something occur and you know that it's wrong and you don't do anything, you're basically doing what we call in the psychological world diffusion of responsibility, meaning you're handing it off to somebody else. And this happens a lot in crowds, where a crowd may watch something occur that's horrific, and everybody in the crowd thinks that somebody else in the crowd is going to do something, and then as a consequence, nobody does anything, and the horrific event transpires. So being a bystander and learning how to intervene speaks to that level of intolerance. We're not going to tolerate watching horrific events unfold in front of us if we can do something, even if that's something, we're not asking people to jump in front of a knife fight, but you can absolutely get on the phone and call the police instead of filming it with your cell phone. Understanding what you aren't going to tolerate, and then also in recognition, I guess the other side of that coin is noticing what society does tolerate and deciding that you're not going to be a part of it. Speak a little bit to that and how that's moving into the new realm and the new job that you have, because a lot of that is, what are you tolerating, and then increasing your alertness and your sensitivities to the things that aren't acceptable.
Right.